Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here for another one of my comparison videos, this time between the Viltrox AF 16mm F1.8 versus the new Sony FE 16mm F1.8 G. I loved the Viltrox when it was released, now in May of 2023. I really felt like a breakthrough for the company Viltrox. It was the first of their full-frame lenses that felt kind of next level, more like premium, and in fact, a lot of the design elements that we first saw in this lens have made it into their newer premium lineup of Lab series lenses. And so it was all of those things, more feature-rich, more high-performing optically. And I really gave it a glowing review at that point because at that stage, there really was nothing quite like it. Even though there's many, many lenses on Sony, there really wasn't anything with that combination of maximum aperture, focal length, and certainly not price. Sony has now released their own 16mm F1.8 in the form of the FE 16mm F1.8 G lens. And obviously they've had a couple of extra years of engineering, and it comes with a lot of advantages relative to the Viltrox. At the same time, the MSRP of the Viltrox is $580 USD, though it can often be had for as little as $500, whereas the Sony is $798, or roughly $800. So that begs the question, is the new Sony worth $300 more? Well, that's what we're here to explore in today's comparison. Now, before I jump into what's different between these lenses, let's talk about a few of the things that maybe you can set aside as being criteria for choosing between them. Obviously, they have the same focal length and they have the same maximum aperture. And so both 16mm, both maximum aperture of f1.8, and for that matter, both have the same minimum aperture of f22. They also have a very similar feature set. They have the ability to use the manual aperture ring, either clicked or declicked. They have the option of having a custom function button that you can program to whatever different function you want, an AF/MF switch, all of those kind of basic yet premium features that we've come to expect from lenses in 2025. And so all of those boxes are checked. Both of them, if you go into the declicked mode of the aperture, can actually achieve a fairly smooth aperture rack. I find with some lenses, even if you can declick the aperture, there's still very visible steps in the aperture racking. That's not true of either one of these lenses, and so you really can, as you can see, pull aperture with either one of them and rack through the various aperture modes, particularly if you move slowly and carefully in doing so. They both have thorough weather sealing, starting from coatings on the front element, rear gaskets, and then internal seals all throughout. Both of them are equipped to be used in adverse conditions. Surprisingly, because the Sony has a more sophisticated focus system in that it has a dual of their XD linear motors, whereas this has an STM focus motor. But because of the maximum aperture and focal length combination, the truth of the matter is that autofocus performance is about the same. I saw similar amounts of speed, similar amounts of smoothness. They're both roughly equally quiet. The Sony does have an advantage that I'll get to in a moment when it comes to the autofocus, but really, I wouldn't even consider that to be a strongly differentiating factor between the two. Now, there is a difference between the two that I'm going to call a neutral difference, not an advantage for either one. And that is that they both have slightly different color signatures. And one thing I did note is that the white balance tends to come off a little bit different between the two. And so, for example, in this comparison, you can see that the color looks a little bit different. However, if I equalize the white balance between the two, the color looks less different, but there is still some subtle differences. And so I find the Sony to be a little bit cooler. I would say the Viltrox is slightly warmer by comparison. Maybe the Viltrox is ever so slightly more saturated in its color. You're going to have to decide which of those two actually appeals to your eye more. So now let's talk about some reasons to choose the Viltrox. The Viltrox, probably the most obvious and a significant one, is going to be the price. It is currently $500 you can get it for at the moment, and so that is $300 less. In other words, the Sony cost about 46% more. Obviously, if you're on a tight budget and you're looking at something saying, I like a wide-angle prime, but I don't want to have a massive investment into it, well, the Viltrox might be more appealing for that reason alone. We'll also note that the Viltrox is a little bit more customizable between the two. Both of them do have a custom button, but the Viltrox actually has two function buttons, and it has this LCD screen. And one of the things that you can do with that LCD screen is you can actually set A/B focus, and so that you can set that up to where you can go between those two, and you can have pull A/B focus back and forth. And so it's just one more layer of customization and feature that isn't present on the Sony. So that might be one reason to consider it. Another reason to consider the Viltrox is that it has massively less distortion than what the Sony does. The Sony has a ton of barrel distortion, whereas while it's not perfectly neutral, it is pretty close to being neutral in terms of I really can't dial in distortion correction in either direction without making things worse. And so it has very, very little distortion, whereas the Sony has a ton of distortion. It also has very slightly less coma. Now that might be offset by having more vignette, but it does have less coma, and so if you're looking for a lens specifically for shooting the night sky, the Viltrox, particularly at a cheaper price, might be more advantageous for you because it does have a little bit astigmatism in the corner and getting that kind of growing wings on the star points and the edges. And so those are some reasons to consider the Viltrox over the Sony. However, there is a pretty exhaustive list of reasons to choose the Sony. Obviously, the Sony is much, much smaller. It is 73.8 millimeters in diameter by 75 millimeters in length, which makes it 12 millimeters narrower than what the Viltrox is, and a whopping 28 millimeters shorter. It also uses 67 millimeter versus 77 millimeter filters, and so a secondary consideration, if you have no filters, and it's not a matter of sharing, it's going to be cheaper to buy filters for the Sony because of its smaller size. It is also much, much lighter. It is only 304 grams versus 550 grams. So that's a difference of 246 grams, which is obviously very, very significant. The Sony does have one feature that the Viltrox doesn't have, and that is that it does have an iris lock. And so you have the option, if you're not an aperture ring fan, you can lock out of the aperture ring, or if you want to make sure as you're maybe doing aperture racking that you don't ever get out of that manual aperture ring, and you can lock into it to making sure that you're staying there. It also has much, much higher magnification. It's designed with floating elements that allow it to focus up closer. So yes, there will be a little bit of a clunk in there if the lens is off of the camera and it's powered off. But if you energize that, in other words, you connect it to a camera and turn the camera on, that clunking goes away because those are floating elements. That's a purposeful design, and its purpose is to allow you for the lens to be able to focus up closely. And so basically it's allowing that focusing group to move a little bit when it needs to. And so in this case, it can focus much more closely, and it can achieve a much higher level of magnification. Even at its autofocus level, it can achieve as high as 0.25 times. But if you manually focus, you can go from a minimum focus distance of 15 centimeters down to 13 centimeters, and you can boost that magnification up to 0.30 times. The Viltrox only has a 0.10 times, so not a strength for it. And if you compare them side by side, you can see that the amount of magnification you can achieve is pretty radically different. I will also note that the Sony's 11 aperture blades, they are rounder and they allow you to keep a more circular shape to the specular highlights when the lens is stopped down. So another advantage there. Now, I will also note that the Sony lens is wider. Now, that's a little bit less true once you correct for all that barrel distortion, because it does leave some extra room for correction to eliminate that. And so that advantage kind of goes away a little bit if you correct for the barrel distortion, but you do have the potential where you don't need to correct for it, that it is considerably wider. And by the numbers, it is wider. It can go as wide as 107 degrees versus, I believe, about 105.3 degrees. And so it does have the ability to get a little bit wider, even though they have the same stated focal length. You also get some Sony-specific features when using a first-party Sony lens. And so while autofocus, I didn't feel like radically favored the Sony, it does allow you to achieve a much higher burst rate. It means that you're going to get, full-time autofocus all the way up to 120 frames per second on an A9 Mark III. Even on my Alpha 1, it will give you up to 30 frames per second, whereas you can only achieve 15 frames per second on the Viltrox. It'll also benefit from features, camera-specific features like focus breathing compensation, which Sony reserves only for first-party lenses and not for third-party lenses. Now, whereas the Viltrox has much lower distortion, the Sony has much lower vignette, about half the level of vignette that the Viltrox does, and so that is one key advantage that we have there. The Sony is also the sharper of the two. Now, they are both very sharp lenses, they both have good contrast, but the Sony is just that extra edge better. And as you can see in this comparison even of the MTF chart, you can see that there's more of the performance that is above the 80% level than what the Viltrox does. And that bears out in real-world images as well, where I just see a contrast and detail advantage pretty much across the frame, particularly in real-world shots for the Sony lens. It's extremely sharp, and it has a little bit better contrast as well. And so overall, I would say that the optical performance does slightly favor the Sony, even though it does have a more significant flaw in the form of the barrel distortion. So in conclusion, I would think it would be fair to say that the Viltrox really has two key advantages. It has a much lower price and a much lower level of distortion. But Sony essentially wins pretty much all the other categories. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's sharper, and it has all of the Sony home cooking advantages. The Viltrox remains an excellent lens, and I think that if you are budget constrained, I would say absolutely go for it. It's an awesome lens. But if you're willing to maybe wait a little bit longer and save a little bit more, my recommendation is to save up and buy the Sony. It is, I believe, the superior lens, and particularly the superior lens when you consider the fact that it is so compact and small. It's probably going to make it into your bag more often, and thus the lens that gets used more often in many ways is the lens with the better value, in my opinion. Now, if you want more information on either lens, you can check out my full either text or video reviews that are both linked in the description down below. There are buying links for both lenses. I hope this has helped you out today. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.